If you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis 50. We're going to finish our study of the life of Joseph today. This is the final chapter. We've seen a lot of his life. We've followed him from his birth and childhood, and we've tracked him as he's been going through the different houses. His life has been categorized with the houses in which he's been a part of. The first one being his own house, the house of his father, the house of Jacob, where he is elevated to a position of authority. But then out of sin and hatred for him and jealousy, his brothers sell him into slavery, where then he is now in the house of Potiphar in Egypt, where he also raises into a place of authority, and Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him. And then he's thrown into jail as a slave, but then as well raises to a position of authority within the jail. And then he's forgotten by the two people he helped in the jail. But God used that for 2 years later. He then helps Pharaoh interpret the dreams and becomes the second in command of all of Egypt in the house of Pharaoh. And he is put in second in command over Egypt so that he can prepare in the 7 years of plenty, according to Pharaoh's dream, and for the 7 years of famine. And during those 7 years of famine, he's put into contact with his estranged brothers, where we see various other story arcs teaching and showing us their reunion and how he's dealing with that. And eventually, he has to reveal himself because he realizes that he could potentially hurt his father, whom he loves dearly. And revealing himself, he calls immediately for his father to come down to Egypt so he can take care of him. And we saw that in the latter chapters of Jacob moving down and being sanctioned by God, and then God's blessings in Egypt. Where we saw literally him bowing before Joseph and fulfilling that initial dream that Joseph had back in the age of 17. And in the last few weeks, we've been covering the final preparations for Jacob's passing, which was the blessings on Joseph's sons, in particular in 48, and then in 49, the blessings and final words he's given to all of his 12 sons. And these are his final words on his deathbed. And I want to remind you of the final verse in 49, which says, Then Jacob finished charging his sons, and he drew his feet into his bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. He did this in the presence of his sons that fulfilled a prophecy that was given to him before he went down to Egypt when he was in Bethel, when God said that it's okay, I'll be with you, you can go down, and your son Joseph will close your eyes at death. And here that was fulfilled. That 17-year-old prophecy and promise that God gave to him was fulfilled. So once again, even in this chapter, the end of Jacob's life, the text is emphasizing that God is faithful to his promises and worthy to be trusted. And that's the context for our last chapter, which I've entitled The End. Genesis 50, verses 1 through 26. I know, an original, exciting title. But through this, we're going to see three stages of ends and three parts to this chapter. And the first stage is the end of Jacob, where we see it's the burial of Jacob. And that's going to cover the first 14 verses. The first section, verses 1 through 3, we see Joseph's initial response to his father's death. So we're in the same scene as we were in the last chapter, in the room where Jacob has just died. And verse 1 through 3 says, And Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Now 40 days were required for it, for such was the period required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept over him 70 days. So the first verse, it conveys to us the initial emotional response of Joseph to his father, who he loved. He was deeply affected by his father. And this same kind of weeping and kissing and weeping over him is the same kind of reaction he had when he was reunited with his father. And verse 2 through 3, he gives him honor and orders that he is to be embalmed, and which is the idea of being mummified, so that his remains would be preserved. Now, the mummification is typical way that an Egyptian would end his life once he's died, if they could afford it. It showed honor in that culture. But as far as Israelis go, The mummification or embalming of any Israeli or God's people, this is the only chapter where we find that. And it specifically has to do with them being an Egyptian culture, and that's a state of honor. And that process of becoming a mummy or being embalmed is an elaborate process. There are a couple of different ways that they've done it. But in essence, it's the removal of internal organs and placing the body in embalming fluid for about 40 days to preserve it. And the Egyptian thought behind it is that they wanted to preserve the body because the body was a building for the soul after death. So typically in Egyptian culture, it was united with a religious practice and performed by priests and associated with the Egyptian god Anubis, which is a jackal god, the god of the dead. And they put the organs in these jars on the side here, which are called canopic jars. But this, notice that in this text, it says that Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians. And it very well could be because this process was so inundated with religion and in the worship of false gods, that the text purposely put physicians there instead of priests, to distance himself that this was not in worship or preparation in the thoughts of Egyptian gods. But this was done out of honor in the culture, but this was done in full belief and faith in God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, and that this was not a religious procedure. So anyway, going through this procedure, Jacob's body would be preserved, and that he would be able to be carried and taken from Egypt all the way into Canaan. And that was definitely a plus to have him preserved so that his body would not be decaying and smelling horrible, and they could do that. Notice in the end of verse 3, it says, "And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. This is referring to all of Egypt. This was an official mourning. They may have viewed Jacob as being honored here as a visiting dignitary, one from Canaan who has moved down. And the reason why we're saying this is when pharaohs died, they mourned 72 days. So this is just short of the honor that they give for pharaohs. And if you think about that, that is a little more than 2 months. So there'll be a national mourning for more than 2 months. That is a huge honor given to Jacob. And after this time of mourning and embalming was complete, well, then it was time for the burial of Jacob, verses 4 through 13. And we see that in the text, it's divided up into different sections. And in the first, we see the request to go and bury his father in Canaan, verses 4 through 6, where the text says, "And the days of mourning for him were past. Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, 'If now I have found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I'm about to die in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. Now, therefore, please let me go up and bury my father. Then I will return.' And Pharaoh said, 'Go up, bury your father, as he made you swear.'" So notice Joseph is going to the house of Pharaoh. This would refer to Pharaoh's court, the other rulers and elders of the land of Egypt. And the question we have to ask is why? Why doesn't he go straight to Pharaoh? Why doesn't he have an audience with Pharaoh himself? It probably has to do with Joseph in a state of mourning. It could be culturally or ritualistically. He would have on mourning clothes, and sometimes mourning clothes were not allowed to go into the presence of a king. He could be cultically impure, handling the corpse and praying over the corpse, or something of that nature. It's keeping Pharaoh in a distance from Joseph because of the association with a dead body in mourning. So here Joseph goes to the appropriate rulers, and he makes an appeal to Pharaoh in 3 different ways. Number 1, he appeals on the basis of his dying father's request. Number 2, he makes an appeal that Joseph swore. He made a promise, and he has to keep that promise. He has to be a man of integrity, a man of honor. And then number 3, he appeals to Pharaoh by saying that his father prepared a burial chamber for himself in Canaan. Now that is very important in Egyptian culture. You can just think about the pyramids. That was something that they were planning and building throughout their life. It was extremely important. So you can see how Pharaoh would be more inclined to say, yes, You need to go to Canaan so he can be buried in the place that he has prepared for himself. And there's two important values here that we need to keep in mind and to look at. And that is, one, it was a huge value for Joseph as being someone who feared and loved God to keep his word, to keep his promises. And then number two, to honor his father. And those are two of the Ten Commandments, not to bear false witness and to honor your father and mother. And we see these things already in the place in Joseph's life as a man of faith. Now, there's another question I want to ask before we move on, and that is, why is it so important for us, the reader, to know this? Why is Joseph asking permission from Pharaoh? Well, number one, there's four reasons. Number one, Joseph would be far away from his duties in ruling over the country. So there have to be other people put in place to do the task that Joseph normally does. Number two, this act connects Joseph and his father with the land of Canaan, opposed to Egypt. Do you remember the big emphasis of Jacob was, let me be buried in that land because that's where our people belong. That's where God has promised us. So by doing that, Joseph is associating with his allegiance with another land, with another country. So that could have political ramifications and political fallout. And so that's another reason why he has to ask Pharaoh. Number three, a funeral like this would be at great monetary cost to the nation. So that's another consideration. And then finally, number four, the whole burial, the details that are given, the emphasis in the text on Canaan, it gives Israel, the later generations of Israel, a legitimate claim to that land, to ownership there, and that their ancestors are buried there. So Pharaoh allows for the funeral, and so we then read about the company who attended the funeral, verses 7 through 9. It says, so Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the household of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's household. They left only their little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. You notice the repetition of the all and the inclusive the households. This is hyperbole. It's literally not every single person, but it's used to show the vast number of people that are going up. This inclusive nature shows the great honor and respect that they're paying to Jacob. And they're doing that because of Joseph, because of what Joseph has done and the man that Joseph is. We have to remember that this is, depending on where in Egypt they're coming from, a 200 to 300 mile foot trek. I mean, some people would have carts and horses and chariots, as you're going to see, but not everyone. And it shows a great, great honor. And if you notice at the end here, it says that they went up both with chariots and horsemen. What this is saying, chariots, as you can see here, what they looked like, was the tank of the day. It was the major military machine. So in essence, when it says that they went up with chariots and horsemen, they're having a military escort. So this is a full national cemetery funeral procession. It'd be like saying today, if we're going out and marching out 200 or so miles to a burial plot, we'll be accompanied by tanks and fighter jets and helicopters. It would be that grand, that big. And this other picture here is just showing a funeral procession. There's usually also women here. You see them with hands on their heads showing mourning. You see usually the Egyptians carried a coffin, usually in a boat shape or just plain, where they would carry the coffin filled with the cadaver to the burial spot. And the question that's interesting as well is, why are the children left? And why does it say that they left the flocks as well? Well, like we said, this is a huge trip, and they went on the main road because of the chariots and the carts going up this way. This is 200 to 300 miles. So children and flocks would just simply slow them down. And further, if they had children and flocks with them, they would have to pay attention to them. Children and flocks had great needs, and they couldn't get away from it. And they needed to focus on the task at hand. And that, as well, is giving respect and honor to Jacob, that their attention can solely be on him, his memory, and giving him honor. And then secondly, though, by keeping their animals and children in Egypt, especially in the land of Goshen, it guarantees that Joseph and the family will be returning because their valuables are there. And notice this route, it somewhat foreshadows the route that Israel will take after the Exodus, going up to the right of the land and crossing the river Jordan some 400 years later. And when they reach the land of Canaan, we read about a time of great mourning, verses 10 through 11. It says, when they came to the threshing floor at Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. And he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Now, when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians." Therefore, it was named Abel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. Now, the location of Atad, the word means thorn bush. The location is unknown. It's not exactly known where it is, but traditionally, from Jerome and Eusebius, they located just south of Jericho, which is a fine location because it says they crossed over the Jordan. So this is probably the location, somewhere in that vicinity. And because it's on the threshing floors were usually on top of an elevation, a hilltop. And because this is in the Jordan Valley, if you see this lighter colored here in the map, that is a very steep incline where there's a lot of mountains and hills, and it is not conducive to chariots or horses. So this is a perfect place for them to stop. They're in the land of Canaan, and they have safe passage. This is a great place. And a threshing floor is a large area where they would stomp on the grains to get the kernels out of the husks. So it was a large, flat, open area, a great place to have a meeting and a place to camp. It was known in the culture as a place of business, a place of law, and a place of life because of the grain. So it was a great place to have this ceremony. And there he mourned, Joseph mourned, and everyone else with him. So there, in the land of Canaan, they had a time of mourning for 7 days. And they had some form of ceremony while they were there. And that sign of mourning, that elaborate procession and ceremony that occurred, made such an impression with the people of the land, because, mind you, this is a large company, so the people of the land would what are you doing? You know, are they here to invade, trouble? And they've obviously seen that this was mourning, and this huge company. And so they rename this location, which is, they now call it Abel Mitzrayim. Abel means streams, and it probably means streams of tears that are falling. And Mitzrayim is the word for Egyptian. So it's the streams of mourning from the Egyptians. And there's probably a wordplay there with Abel, because Abel means mourning. So they rename it, and that renaming of that location, it gives a lasting memorial to this event, which gives greater honor. And notice the two peoples that are giving honor to Jacob, the Egyptians and the Canaanites. 400 years later, and when we get to the book of Exodus, those are two enemies of Israel that want to destroy them. But here, God is inscripturating for us and writing down for us that in his plan, anything can happen, and he's having these two cultures and people honor the foundation of a nation. And once again, the renaming of this town is another historical marker of the event and claim to the burial of that land. So now at this point, we read about the conclusion of the funeral, verses 12 through 14. And 12 to 14 says, "Thus his sons did for him as he had charged them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, before Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After he was buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So his sons, and undoubtedly others, continued on southward to Machpelah, to the family tomb. So they traveled from here down to the right around Hebron. And the sons were faithful. They did what they promised, what their father had requested. Their father requested to Joseph privately in chapter 47, but then also to all 12 sons at his deathbed. And they fulfilled that. Even though that was this great expense and great time investment, they did that. And the tomb, if you go to Israel, can be seen today in this building. Herod the Great, from the 1st century BC, the one who tried to destroy the baby Jesus, he built this structure around the traditional site of Abraham's tomb, and it's one of the only constructions of Herod that's still intact in its entirety. It was reformatted. You can see it's right in the middle of the town of Hebron, modern town. This is it from this vantage point. You can see that there was some other structures that were added to it. It is now a mosque, and it's literally called the Mosque of Machpelah. So if you go to Israel, that's where it is. And we see in the text that Joseph returned to Egypt. He is, again, faithful to what he said he would do. He told Pharaoh that he would come back, and then he came back. So this marks the end of the first stage, the end of Jacob, and the end of his life in an honorable burial. The next stage involves fear and comfort. Verses 15 through 21. And we first read about the fear of Joseph's brothers. Verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father had died, or was dead, they said, what if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? Wow, things have changed. There's an unknown there, and fear sets in. What caused this fear? Why would they even think this way? There's 4 things I want to bring out. Number 1, Joseph has authority and has great power over them. Number 2, their own sinful hearts and the sin of the world has taught them not to trust people. The sin of their hearts. A lot of times we always think other people are thinking the same way we do. Man, if I was in his spot, maybe I would get even. Oh, I hope he's not going to do that as well. And then knowing and living in a sin-filled world, we've been hurt before. And so we tend to try to protect ourselves, build walls, be cautious, try to avoid everything, and thus avoid people. Try to prepare for every contingency. But not trusting in God's people, in the family of God, that is not his plan. We are supposed to have brotherly love, a community of trust, one that is at peace and at home. Our relationships should be one that show forth Christ-likeness, the eternal life. It's supposed to be a foreshadowing of what heaven's going to be like. And we can have trust in the body of Christ, in our family, because we are a people that are striving to live holy lives, to live godly lives, to be more like Christ. But you can understand when you live with someone and you're receiving their love or their goodness, you can easily take it for granted, or your mind can play tricks on you. Think about your spouse. Have you ever saw your spouse and you've been married for so many years, and yet you say one day, can that person really love me? They really can't. They're just saying that. They're just stuck with me. Right? It can easily happen. And then what do we have to go back on? We have to go back on experience and then their words. We have to trust their hearts and trust that they are God-honoring and faithful. Number 3, which is part of number 2, is part of this thinking is their own guilt. They still have guilt. Now, it's either continuing or it's coming back. But either way, they're not accepting Joseph's forgiveness. They don't believe it's real. They know that 17 years they've experienced his kindness. They've been given land and food and provisions. But the mind plays tricks. And the mind here is deceiving them to think of other excuses. It's not because he really loves me, but it's because he really just loves our father. And now that our father is dead, all bets are off. And Joseph first revealed himself to his brothers because he loved their father, right? He didn't want to hurt his father more, so he revealed himself to his brothers. And they had a great emotional reunion. He didn't hug and cry over their necks. And presumably they had a close relationship for those 17 years. So if Joseph spared them to please his father, then what about now? So if you notice, Joseph has authority and power. That's the means to punish. The sons are thinking and knowing that their own hearts are sinful and the world around them is also sinful. So they're thinking that Joseph has the motive to punish. And then now that their father is gone, Joseph now has the opportunity to punish. The means, the motive, and now the opportunity. And as we look at this, we're seeing that forgiveness chain is being broken. There's offense made, there's acknowledgement and repentance, and sometimes it includes restitution, and then there's a forgiveness on the part of Joseph and a reception. We've seen all of this already, and we've seen reconciliation. But why? What is happening here that's threatening that reconciliation? Looking at all this, most of this is all mental. It's in the heart. It's a heart attitude and a belief. And this is our chain so far, and we've been missing one important aspect of the chain, which is commitment. Once there's reconciliation, there has to be a commitment to keep that reconciliation. To be committed to, once forgiven, it's gone. And once being forgiven, you have to trust in the reality of that person who forgave you. The bottom line here is they did not continue to trust in his words, his promises, and in his relationship with God. Their lack of trust in Joseph caused a rift in their reconciliation, in their unity. So then we read about Joseph's reaction to their written plea. So they react, they respond, and they first respond by writing to him. And then they're going to come into him in person. But first they write a message, and they say, so they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father charged before he died, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sins, for they did you wrong. From these words, we see they're really afraid. So they first write to Joseph, trying to secure their safety by invoking Jacob's words, their father's words. And they're relying on Joseph's loyalty and obedience to their father. Notice that they say, it's your father said this, not our father. They're really focusing on Joseph's relationship to their father, and they've seen his respect and honor throughout his life, and they're banking on that. Don't ruin that now. Keep that up. And this is what he said, please forgive. The word forgive there is not the normal word. It literally means to lift up. And it has a connotation of lifting up one's face by showing them grace and showing them favor. And thus, by showing them favor, you're not punishing them, you're giving them forgiveness. And here it says, please forgive them, I beg you, the transgression of your brother. The transgression means the breaking of God's law. It's out of rebellion against God. And then they give a parallel term, and their sin. Sin is missing the mark, falling short of that standard of righteousness. Transgression is breaking that, rebelling against it. And then he says, for they did wrong, the general word for evil, for wickedness, that brings misfortune and disaster. And thus, you notice here, there's no excuses. It's not, oh, but they were young, they were foolish. Yeah. No, they did wrong. But he's asking for forgiveness for their wrong. So these words, they're of his father. And they seemed desperate with a repetition of the pleases here. In Hebrew, this word for beg is actually please again. And then they add their own words, and they say, now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. So then the words of the brother echo the message from their father, and they call themselves servants, literally slaves of the God of your father. And so they're invoking now their relationship with God. Now that's opposed to the relationship of the Egyptians to the false gods. And it's a God that's associated again with your father. So they're saying that they are loyal to God. And we need to remember at this time that these sons, these brothers, the sons of Jacob, they're in their late 50s and in their 60s. They have sons that are grown of their own. It's possible that some of them have grandchildren already. And they're making an appeal like this with great desperation. They are frightened. And it's interesting here because the text is actually ironic. Because this message of not trusting Joseph is a transgression. And so in reality, Joseph has to forgive this transgression of their attitudes and their message. So how does Joseph react to this message? And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Now literally, it's not they spoke verbally, it's they spoke through this message, through this messenger. So why would Joseph weep? What caused this emotional reaction of sadness? 4 reasons. Number 1, his father and his brothers thought that he was a vindictive man. Number 2, that he had not really forgiven them, but that it was a lie. It was all a cover. Now, has Joseph ever deceived them and covered up his true identity to make them believe something else? Yes, he did. So here we see it's coming back to bite him. We're seeing his initial sin of deceiving them, not just coming straight forth with the truth, with openness. It's actually caused them not to trust him as much. Number 3, why is Joseph weeping? That he had only shown them favor for the past 17 years because of their father. That's what they're thinking, that he's only shown them favor because of their father. And then number 4, he's weeping because they still fear him. They don't trust him. So the message was sent, and then it was followed by a personal visit in verses 18 through 21. In verse 18 it says, Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. Literally, we're your slaves. So if we had any doubt that before the brothers didn't fulfill Joseph's dream about bowing down, because we could have said earlier they didn't really know it was Joseph, they know it's Joseph here, and they consciously and they choose to bow down, fulfilling again this promise. And they call themselves your servants, your slaves. They're literally offering themselves to repay their crimes. That's not reconciliation. They're still back in trying to bring restitution. And it's hard for us as people to receive forgiveness because we're not forgiving people. People often, even when we know that we're saved completely by grace, we want to work for our salvation. Or we want to work for our standing with God, or we want to work to gain God's favor. We feel that we need to earn it. We're not earning our keep. But that's not why we obey God or follow his instructions. We do that because we have a relationship of love, because we want to please him. We want to live the way he's created us. And we want to live in perfect fellowship and relationship with him. And so the same is true here. They can't do these things. They're trying to please Joseph. They need to act a certain way and behave a certain way because they love him, because they're in a relationship with him, in a brotherly love, in family. And Joseph is weeping because this is somehow in their minds been all destroyed. So Joseph responds in 4 ways, which are important for us to see. First, he states his own position. He says, but Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place?" He's saying they don't need to be afraid because he has forgiven them and is allowing God to be the judge. When we say we forgive someone, we forego punishing, us being the one who punishes them. We move that off to God. It's God's place. Joseph acknowledges that God is the only one true judge of man's hearts and his actions. And this is a command we find throughout Scripture. Romans 12:9 says, "Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, and I will repay,' says the Lord." And this comes from Paul's quoting Deuteronomy 32:35. So this has always been the ways of God. And we know that he will repay because either Christ paid for it or they're going to pay for it in hell. There's only one of two options, but we leave that judgment up to God. So if Joseph doesn't place himself as judge over their moral decisions, it's implied that he also places himself as their equals. And thus he himself is saying that he is a slave of Yahweh. He is a servant of Yahweh. So he's acknowledging, this is my position. I'm your brother. Secondly, he states his faith in God's providence. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." So it's fascinating. Joseph states the facts. What you did, it was evil. He doesn't sugarcoat it. It's all right. No, it's evil. What you did was wrong. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But his unfavorable experience was worth it. And he would do it again because God's intentions, God meant, his mind, his intentions, purpose, plan, were to bring about a great good through him. And if he had to experience suffering in order to accomplish that, Joseph was willing to do it again. In essence, what he's saying is, I didn't suffer for no reason at all. My suffering had meaning. It had purpose. This is parallel to what Paul says in Romans 8. "For we know, we can trust, be assured, have peace, that all things work together for good to those who love God in that relationship and to those who have been called according to his purpose." What's his purpose? That means his purpose is to bring about his will through our lives. We can rest in this knowing that all things work eventually for good. As Joseph's story, he had many years of suffering, but it was used for good in thousands of people's lives. So we can see that God's providence, even in and through man's wickedness, he can bring life from death, beauty from harm. We see this most clearly and ultimately in the cross. He brought life and beauty and grace and mercy through an instrument of death and horror and shame. When we talk about God's providence, it's God's superintending activity over human actions in human history, bringing creation to its divinely determined goal. It means God is at work through human history. So God used their wickedness towards Joseph to bring about a great good, which Joseph tells us what it is. It says, in order to bring this present result. That's the first result. This present result, referring to his position of honor and his position in Egypt, which bears witness to God. Right? That whole situation was, there's a Hebrew, a guy who worships God, who can interpret dreams, came before, and then he did it. And then he carried out his work with honor, with wisdom, and that all of that was a testimony to Yahweh. And then number 2, he says, to preserve many people alive. That position of authority and honor and represented Yahweh, that was equal to the main purpose of preservation of life. And notice, it's life in general. He didn't say, so that I can preserve you guys. It's life, even of the lost. And we can be assured that many Egyptians came to faith in Yahweh because of Joseph and his brothers and their lives and their testimony. But it shows the great worth and value of human life, all human life. So number 3, he communicates his intentions. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. He will show them favor, as he has done for the past 17 years, even though the famine is over. The famine has only lasted for 7 years. This is 10 plus years he's continued to provide for them. And in the text there, the I is emphatic. I personally will see to your needs. Again, it demonstrates how we are to live. Romans 12:21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Joseph is showering good on them, breaking that cycle of revenge and evil. In the text in Genesis, it says, and I will provide for you and your little ones. It's their children and their grandchildren who are dependent on them and whom they are responsible for. Joseph says, I'm going to take care of it all. Because he knows and is acknowledging that their lives of the children and the grandchildren are just as important as their own. And I know if only I were given food and not the rest of my family, that food would be going outward. So Joseph is saying, I'm taking care of everything. So you can be at peace. You can live at peace. So finally, he also speaks to them personally. Where he says, so he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. The word for comforted there means he gave encouraging words to them concerning their personal situation. And when it says that he spoke kindly, it literally says he spoke to their hearts. Meaning, he spoke to what was troubling their own minds, their own personal struggles. He spoke to them individually. So again, Joseph demonstrates godly character, which we see echoed in the New Testament. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love, giving preference to one another in honor. Joseph stopped, took the time, and sat down and said, and spoke to them and dealt with their own personal struggles, viewing them as being important and valued and honored. Okay, the key point here is that the actions of Joseph's life are determined, first and foremost, not because of his relationship with his father, but because of his relationship with Yahweh, with God. And Joseph remains faithful to his God. He fears ever doing something that would ever displease his God. And that is the overarching principle for this, is that we behave based on our relationship with God, not based upon a relationship with humans, although that is secondary and that is included. The third step and the final step in this chapter is the death of Joseph himself, verses 22 through 26. And in these final verses, we see the conclusion of Joseph's days. They were filled with blessings. Verse 22 and 23 says, now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. 110 years, in ancient Egyptian literature, that is viewed as being the ideal length of time. So that is viewed from Egyptian culture as being a blessing. And then secondly, Joseph saw the third generation of both sons. So he saw his great-grandchildren, which is also a blessing. That's throughout Scripture, that grandchildren are crown upon an old man's head, Proverbs 17:6. In many other places, God blesses by letting the men or family members see their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. And here it says the third generation of Ephraim's sons. We don't have a full genealogy of all the people, but these are the sons that we know of. And then also of Manasseh. He says that the son of Manasseh, Machira's sons, Gilead was from one woman and these other two were from another, that they were born on Joseph's knees. That is a phrase that means that Joseph adopted them as his own children. So they received a greater inheritance, just like Ephraim and Manasseh received a greater inheritance from Jacob. Moving on, verse 24, it says, so Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, But God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. When the text says his brothers, probably not his literal brothers, but referring to his relatives, his descendants. And here we see another blessing on Joseph's life, which is a blessing of dying with peace in the presence of your family, close relatives who can comfort you. And his final words were words of comforting them and pointing them to God, to his care, and to have faith in God. When it says that God will surely take care, that is emphatic there in Hebrew. And the take care literally means that God will visit you, and it sometimes can mean visit you to punish you, but here obviously means visit you to bless you, to bring about his promises. And thus, Joseph's life bore witness to this, that this is the God that he knows, and this is the blessing that he wishes upon them. Verse 25 continues this thought, and it says, Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, repeating the same phrase, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So what he's saying there is, God's going to take care of you and bring you back one day back into Canaan, and when he does, I want you to take my bones up. Now, this view, what he just said in the book of Hebrews, is viewed as a great act of faith. It says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Now, the historian Josephus, first century Jewish historian, said that the rest of the brothers, they were carried up to Hebron when they died. But Joseph wasn't. His bones were kept in Egypt because he was waiting for all the nation to go up. So it shows that he had greater faith that, yes, this was going to happen, this was going to be a reality, and I want to make sure it happens. So he believed in God's promises and thus made that request accordingly. That request, that his bones were still there, that influenced the thinking of countless others that followed him, the descendants, that Canaan was actually their home and not Egypt. And it encouraged them to have faith in God. Wow, my forefather kept his bones here, that one day we're going to go up there. Okay. Well, that's where we need to be. We can't be settled here. That's not our permanent home. And the last verse, 26, says, So Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Embalmed again, he was made into a mummy and placed into a coffin. This is a coffin of Ramses III. It came much later, but this is just an example of a coffin that he would be in. And why would he do that? Well, his body was preserved so that when the time came, they could literally have something that they could carry up with them as an actual representation of, look, this is what the text says, here's his coffin, here's his bones, and we are going to fulfill his actual promise, and look, God has finally brought this to pass. So the text of Genesis ends here. It ends with an expectation of that God will fulfill his promise. He has throughout this story. And thus he will fulfill his promise to bring his people, the sons of Israel, back to the land of Canaan. And they will take Joseph's bones with him. And that is a conclusion of the life of Joseph, with at the very end shows pointing people to God, his faith in God, and even orchestrating his death to lead people to put their trust, their faith in God. So let's move to applications. There's quite a few applications. Number one, Joseph and his brothers kept their promises and honored their father by burying him in the family tomb in Canaan as it requested. Additionally, Joseph kept his promise to Pharaoh and returned to Egypt. The people of God are marked as people who keep their promises. Number two, for relationships to continue in unity, we must be committed to the promises and the words that brought us to reconciliation. Do not let the enemy steal the joy and peace of reconciled relationships. Be committed to forgiveness and be committed to receiving forgiveness. Number three, Joseph dealt with the difficulties of life that he experienced by embracing four things. First, he knew that God is a righteous judge of his people. Number two, he had faith in God's providence in his personal history. Number three, he was committed to doing good. And number four, he took the time to address the individual concerns and fears of others, showing them brotherly love. Number four, The good purpose of God in Joseph's life was directed at saving human life. This passage clearly assigns value and worth to all human life and marks the preservation of life as a great good. Number 5, the actions and behaviors of our lives are determined and shaped first and foremost by our relationship with Yahweh. Human relationships motivate us, but only in conjunction with our love and devotion to God. Number 6, we need to remember that God will surely take care of us and fulfill his promises. Joseph's life is his example of that fact. And then number 7, Joseph uses his death to encourage and influence people to trust in the promises and goodness of God. If his death can do that, surely our lives can. Do our lives encourage and influence people to trust in God? And that is the end of the book of Genesis for us.